The town had hanged people before, and the winter frost had always finished the job. But it had never faced a woman who simply refused to die. On a freezing morning, her body was left swinging from a barren branch. The crowd walked away, certain their dark justice was complete. They had handed down a sentence of death, burying her in the snow just to be sure. But the rope did not take her life. This is the story of an execution that failed, and the bizarre miracle of a condemned woman who opened her eyes. In the year 1684, the town of Hadley, Massachusetts, was a place defined entirely by its strict borders and its even stricter beliefs. It sat isolated on the edge of the known frontier, a small, fragile settlement surrounded by a vast and unforgiving wilderness. The people who lived there viewed the dark woods beyond their fields not just with natural caution, but with a profound spiritual suspicion. They were Puritans, men and women who had built a community upon a foundation of rigid piety and a terrifying certainty that the devil walked among them daily. In Hadley, the winter cold was not merely a changing of the seasons. It was a physical manifestation of a harsh world where an angry God watched every step, and malevolent forces waited just outside the door. Survival meant staying together, adhering strictly to religious laws, and never deviating from the collective faith. It was a place of dim, firelit rooms where the wind howling through the floorboards was easily mistaken for the whispers of the damned. It was an environment perfectly primed for paranoia, where an unexplained misfortune was never just considered bad luck. It was always a sign of a spiritual breach. At the very center of this rigid and watchful society stood a man named Philip Smith. He was exactly the kind of figure a vulnerable town like Hadley leaned upon for stability. Serving as a deacon, a local magistrate, and a lieutenant in the town militia, Smith was an undeniable pillar of both religious and secular authority. He was a man who dispensed local justice, managed town affairs, and stood as a moral compass for his neighbors. He was, by all accounts, a man shielded by his own righteousness. Then, in the dying months of the year, this untouchable man was struck down. His decline was not the slow, quiet fading of an aging elder. It was a sudden, violent physical collapse that left him bedridden and writhing in agonizing pain. The suddenness of his affliction shocked the town to its core. A man of his immense stature, supposedly armored by his unwavering faith and good deeds, was reduced almost overnight to a state of helpless suffering. He tossed violently under his heavy blankets, crying out in a language of pure agony and speaking of mysterious shapes hovering by his bed in the dead of night. The medicine of the 17th century offered little comfort and even fewer answers. Physicians of the era relied on a rudimentary, often brutal understanding of the human body, armed with treatments that frequently did more harm than the disease itself. They came to Philip Smith's bedside, observed his terrifying convulsions, and applied their remedies to absolutely no avail. His pain defied their herbs, their bleeding, and their logic. As his physical condition rapidly deteriorated, his desperate groans echoed through the quiet, wooden halls of his home, slipping out into the freezing, tense streets of Hadley. The failure of medicine was the exact thing that opened the door to darker superstitions. In a community where every shadow held a demon, an incurable, mysterious disease was quickly translated into something far more sinister. The townspeople did not see a failing biological system. They saw a terrifying spiritual battleground. Whispers began to circulate that the noises escaping Smith's lips were not the natural sounds of a dying man, but the mocking voices of familiar spirits. The unbearable pain was no longer considered an illness. It was classified as an affliction of a supernatural origin. Fear has a very specific way of moving through a closed, isolated community. It does not stay neatly confined to the sick room. It spills over the fences, seeps into the wooden pews of the meeting house, and infects the minds of neighbors who begin to view their everyday surroundings through a lens of absolute terror. The citizens of Hadley watched their respected leader suffer, and in his helpless suffering, they saw their own terrifying vulnerability. If a man as righteous and powerful as Philip Smith could be torn apart by invisible forces, no one in the town was safe from the darkness. This collective, suffocating panic demanded a tangible explanation. It required a physical target to bear the massive weight of their spiritual dread. An invisible enemy cannot be caught or fought, but a human proxy can be punished. When the physicians finally stepped back from the bed and admitted there was nothing left to be done, the town of Hadley did not simply surrender to grief. They surrendered to wrath. Because when the doctors gave up, the town of Hadley knew exactly who they needed to blame. To understand how a town decides to murder one of its own, you must first look at who they choose to sacrifice. They did not choose a stranger, and they certainly did not choose someone with power. The target of their mounting hysteria was a woman named Mary Webster. By 1684, Mary was an older woman living in the deep, unforgiving shadows of Hadley's tightly knit society. She was painfully poor, left to navigate a harsh world built entirely for men, and she survived largely on the reluctant charity of the town. But Mary was not the meek, grateful recipient that Puritan society demanded its poor to be. She was known to be sharp-tongued, quick to anger, and fiercely defensive when she felt slighted. In a community where quiet submission was the ultimate virtue for a woman, a loud, disagreeable, impoverished outsider was an uncomfortable anomaly. She was a burden to the town's resources and an irritant to their social order, living a solitary life that left her entirely without the protective shield of belonging. There is a cruel, historical arithmetic to the way witchcraft accusations were handed down in the 17th century. The devil, it seemed, rarely bothered with the wealthy, the well-connected, or the wives of prominent magistrates. Instead, the net almost always fell on women, exactly like Mary Webster. A woman without a husband, a father, or a son to advocate for her was a woman who essentially did not exist in the eyes of the law. Living on the extreme margins, stripped of economic agency, these unprotected women were the easiest receptacles for a community's collective anxiety. When crops failed, when livestock died, or when a sudden, terrifying illness struck, it was infinitely easier to point a trembling finger at the abrasive widow down the lane than to accept the random, devastating nature of reality. Mary fit the mold of a witch not because she possessed dark magic, but because she possessed absolutely no power. She was the perfect, fragile vessel into which the town could pour all of its inexplicable dread. The tragedy of Mary Webster was fatally compounded by her history with the very man who now lay writhing in his deathbed. Philip Smith, in his capacity as a town leader, had often been the one to distribute relief to the poor, including Mary. He was also the authority figure who oversaw local disputes. Naturally, the abrasive widow and the rigid magistrate had clashed. The historical record points to a series of petty, mundane grievances. Arguments over property, harsh words exchanged in the dusty streets, and moments where Mary, feeling cheated or dismissed by the system, had lashed out verbally. In the bright light of a normal day, these were nothing more than the bitter frustrations of a woman pushed to her absolute limits. But as Smith lay dying in agonizing pain, the town began to view those past arguments through the distorted, terrifying lens of the supernatural. The crowd did not see a desperate woman venting her anger. They remembered a witch casting a dark, deliberate curse. Every muttered complaint she had ever made was retroactively weaponized, exaggerated by panic until ordinary friction was transformed into a deliberate act of demonic warfare. The court records of the era reveal a staggering absurdity in how these accusations were formalized into matters of life and death. Evidence of witchcraft rarely required anything tangible. A neighbor claiming they saw a strange shadow, a cow suddenly refusing to give milk, or a sick man hallucinating ghostly figures in his fever. These spectral evidences were entirely sufficient to strip a woman of her humanity and drag her before a judge. For a woman like Mary, raised in poverty and possessing no voice of her own to counter the unified narrative of prominent men, the trap was inescapably tight. She was entirely alone, cornered by a deeply ingrained prejudice that had already decided her guilt long before any formal charge was read. She was not just fighting the sudden illness of Philip Smith, she was fighting the collective imagination of an entire town desperate for a scapegoat. The machinery of justice was quickly set into motion, and Mary was pulled from her fragile life in Hadley and sent miles away to face the High Court. The town assumed they were sending her away to die, but the high judges in Boston did not look at the world the same way the frightened villagers of Hadley did. The journey from the isolated borders of Hadley to the established center of Boston was a grueling passage across a frozen, unforgiving landscape. Mary Webster was hauled away from the only home she knew, transported under guard as a prisoner of the colony. For a destitute woman who had spent her life on the absolute margins of society, this forced march eastward must have felt like a slow, terrifying procession toward the gallows. She was leaving behind a town that had already convicted her in their hearts, heading toward a tribunal of powerful men who held the ultimate authority over life and death. But the High Court in Boston was a vastly different environment from the wooden, fear-drenched rooms of Hadley. Boston was the seat of colonial power, a place of stone buildings, thick ink, and rigid legal precedent. The magistrates who presided there did not operate on the frantic whispers of frightened farmers or the fever dreams of a dying local official. They were men of profound education, individuals who, despite their deep Puritan faith, demanded a colder, more detached form of logic before they would send a citizen to the executioner. When the trial commenced, the stark contrast between rural hysteria and urban jurisprudence became immediately apparent. The witnesses from Hadley took the stand, carrying their deeply ingrained panic into the vast, austere space of the formal courtroom. They spoke of mysterious ailments, of shadows moving in the dead of night, and of harsh words spoken by a bitter widow in the dusty streets. They recounted the agonizing convulsions of their respected deacon, Philip Smith, presenting his horrific suffering as undeniable proof of a dark, supernatural curse. They expected the magistrates to share their terror, to see the devil hiding behind the ragged clothing of the woman sitting before them. But in the bright, unforgiving light of a formal legal tribunal, stripped of the localized dread of a small town, their evidence withered into nothing. The high judges listened to the frantic tales of sick livestock and midnight apparitions, and they remained entirely unmoved. They looked down from their benches and did not see a powerful agent of darkness capable of bringing down a magistrate. They simply saw an old, impoverished, and thoroughly exhausted woman who had been unfortunate enough to make powerful enemies in a frightened village. The legal machinery of the Massachusetts Bay Colony could be exceedingly cruel, and it rarely showed mercy to those without status. Yet, on this particular day, the court remained surprisingly anchored in reason. The magistrates reviewed the spectral evidence presented by the townsfolk and found it fundamentally hollow. They determined that they could not, under the strict guidelines of the law, condemn a human being to hang based solely on the frightened imagination of a sick man and the paranoid assumptions of his neighbors. The heavy wooden gavel fell, and the words "not guilty" were officially entered into the historical record. For a fleeting, miraculous moment, the oppressive weight of the 17th century justice system was entirely lifted. The law had actually worked as a shield for the defenseless. Mary Webster was abruptly declared a free woman. She was permitted to walk out of the formidable courtroom, officially spared from the hangman's noose, carrying a legal absolution that cleared her name of all dark charges. It was a rare, radiant triumph for someone who had spent her entire existence being dismissed, ignored, and abused by the people around her. The sheer relief of that moment offers a profound emotional respite, a brief window where justice genuinely seemed to prevail over blind prejudice. She made the long, arduous journey back to Western Massachusetts with the assumption that the nightmare was finally over, protected by a document signed by the highest authorities in the land. But a piece of paper forged in Boston meant absolutely nothing to a town still gripped by a localized, consuming fever. The high judges had evaluated the facts flawlessly, but they had fundamentally underestimated the blinding, violent power of a terrified mob. Mary had won her case against the law, but she did not know that this very verdict had just signed a far more brutal death sentence from her own neighbors. The news of the acquittal traveled faster than the winter wind, arriving in Hadley long before Mary Webster could make her slow, exhausted return. If the magistrates in Boston believed their piece of paper would calm the local hysteria, they were tragically mistaken. In a settlement already teetering on the edge of utter panic, the legal absolution did not look like the triumph of reason. To the deeply pious, terrified townspeople, it looked as though the devil himself had outsmarted the highest courts in the colony. At the exact moment the law was declaring her innocent, the physical torment of Philip Smith reached its most agonizing, inexplicable peak. Confined to his freezing room, the once powerful deacon was now completely consumed by his affliction. His mind began to fracture, giving way to violent, terrifying hallucinations. He screamed that a spectral woman was sitting upon his chest, suffocating him in the dark, invisible to the frantic family members surrounding his bed. According to the historical accounts of the time, the room filled with strange, sickly odors, and the heavy oak bedstead seemed to shake violently of its own accord. To the desperate neighbors watching a respected leader reduced to babbling terror, the Boston verdict was not just a bureaucratic error. It was a complete abandonment of the righteous. There is a unique and terrifying alchemy that occurs when a group of strictly religious people convince themselves that civil society has failed them. The suffocating dread that had been simmering in Hadley did not dissipate with the court's ruling. Instead, it curdled into a violent, self-righteous fury. These were not outlaws, anarchists, or hardened criminals by nature. They were ordinary farmers, local tradesmen, and devout churchgoers who sat next to each other in the wooden pews every single Sabbath, praying for deliverance. Yet, as they huddled together in dimly lit taverns and cold meeting houses, a dangerous, unspoken consensus began to take root. They reasoned that if the highly educated courts of men were too blind to see the dark magic actively strangling their deacon, then a higher, older law had to be brutally enforced. This is the most dangerous psychological pivot any community can make. It is the exact moment when ordinary men decide that committing a murder is actually a holy obligation. They were no longer a group of frightened, helpless neighbors. Through the contagious poison of mob mentality, they had transformed themselves into a court of shadows, answering only to their own panic and calling it the absolute will of God. As the last grey light of the short winter day finally faded, a brutal, blinding snowstorm descended upon the Massachusetts frontier. The temperature plummeted drastically, turning the unpaved, muddy streets of the settlement into treacherous, frozen ridges of solid ice. The weather itself seemed hostile, but under the cover of this suffocating darkness, the men of Hadley began to gather. They did not speak much, their words stolen by the howling wind, wrapping their thick woolen coats tight against the biting cold. Their grim faces were illuminated only by the erratic orange glow of the torches they carried, casting long, distorted shadows against the snowbanks. In their heavy, calloused hands, they held the instruments of their homemade justice, heavy wooden clubs and a long length of coarse, braided hemp rope. They moved with a terrifying synchronized purpose, their heavy boots crunching rhythmically against the fresh snow as they marched away from the safety of the town center. They were heading toward the desolate, forgotten edges of the settlement, where the poorest and most vulnerable members of their society were left to wither. They were marching deliberately toward the dilapidated, freezing shack of Mary Webster. The true horror of that winter night did not come from the supernatural realm. It did not originate from a witch's dark curse or a demonic entity hiding in the surrounding woods. The true, chilling evil of 1684 came entirely from the familiar, recognizable faces of everyday people. It came from the men who had known Mary for years, men who had passed her on the street, and perhaps even tossed her a coin of reluctant charity, who now stood outside her thin wooden door with murder beating in their hearts. The magistrates in Boston had promised that she was safe, but the law was miles away in a warm, stone building, entirely useless against the primal rage of an isolated village. As the furious mob finally surrounded her small, unlit home, raising their flickering torches against the violent, swirling snow, the distinction between the righteous and the wicked vanished completely in the freezing dark. They had come to the edge of town to execute a monster, but as they kicked down the fragile wooden door, they were about to prove who the real monsters were. The frail wooden door of Mary Webster's home offered absolutely no resistance against the collective weight of the furious men. It splintered violently inward, allowing the howling winter storm to rush into the dark, freezing room where the elderly woman lay sleeping. The mob did not arrive with the formalized language of an official arrest, nor did they carry the sealed warrants of the Boston courts they had grown to so deeply despise. They came entirely with rough hands and the deafening, frantic shouts of a lynch mob executing a holy mission. Mary was dragged violently from her bed, her desperate protests immediately swallowed by the roar of the bitter wind and the angry voices of her own neighbors. An elderly woman, isolated, impoverished, and physically frail, stood no conceivable chance against dozens of men fueled by a terrifying cocktail of righteous panic and blind hatred. They pulled her out into the merciless Massachusetts winter, her bare feet dragging across the sharp, icy ridges of the frozen mud. In the flickering, chaotic light of their raised torches, she was no longer viewed as a human being or a fellow child of God. She had been entirely reduced to a vessel of the devil, a literal monster that had to be physically eradicated for the town to survive. The men of Hadley did not bother to construct a proper gallows. True execution requires the solemnity of the law and the slow, methodical turning of justice. But a lynching only requires a sturdy branch and a blind, collective rage. They found a barren tree standing like a jagged, black skeleton against the turbulent night sky, its thick limbs perfectly suited for their grim purpose. A length of coarse hemp rope, the kind normally used for hauling heavy timber or tethering livestock in the barns, was brought forward and roughly fashioned into a heavy noose. The hands that wrapped the rough fibers around Mary's fragile neck were the exact same hands that turned the pages of Bibles in the meeting house. the same hands that prayed over family dinners. The psychological transition from a devout neighbor to a ruthless executioner was devastatingly complete. Without a trial, without a final prayer, and without a single moment of merciful hesitation, they pulled the heavy rope. Mary was hoisted into the freezing air, her body swinging violently in the unrelenting grip of the winter storm. The terrible mechanics of hanging are rarely instantaneous, and the town watched as the old woman struggled in the suffocating darkness, suspended brutally between the frozen earth she was forced out of, and a heaven they believed would surely reject her. Yet, the cruelty of that night did not conclude when her movements finally ceased. The men of Hadley were not merely killing an annoying neighbor. They were attempting to extinguish an active supernatural threat, and their deep-seated paranoia demanded an absolute, undeniable certainty. According to the detailed historical accounts, later recorded by the prominent Puritan minister Cotton Mather, the mob genuinely feared that a witch's dark power might somehow linger even as she hung lifeless from the branch. They believed that if she was left suspended in the cold air, her malevolent magic might still find a way to travel across the wind and reach the dying Philip Smith. Driven by this superstitious terror, they lowered her limp body back down to the frozen earth. They dragged her through the deep drifts and aggressively rolled her form into the freezing snow, burying her deep within the heavy, icy banks. The bitter winter was deliberately weaponized to finish whatever the hemp rope had started, a brutal attempt to literally freeze the supposed witchcraft out of her very bones. They packed the wet, suffocating snow heavily over her face and limbs, leaving her discarded like refuse in the desolate winter wasteland. It is a profoundly dark chapter of human history when the most brutal acts of violence are committed under the absolute conviction of holiness. The men who buried Mary Webster in the snow did not view themselves as murderers walking away from a crime scene. As they extinguished their torches and marched back to the warmth of their hearths, they genuinely believed they had performed a vital, heroic surgery on their infected town. They left an old woman broken, suffocated, and entombed in the ice, completely confident that the morning sun would bring an end to the demonic plague that had haunted their deacon. The darkness of human nature had entirely overshadowed any trace of Christian mercy, replacing it with the cold comfort of vigilantism. They returned to their beds, certain that the threat of the abrasive widow was permanently erased from the earth, having done everything in their immense power to ensure she would never draw another breath. But the mob, in all its terrifying certainty, had made one fatal, impossible miscalculation about the resilience of the woman they had left behind in the snow. The sun finally rose over Hadley, casting a pale, indifferent light across the frozen, unforgiving landscape. The violent storm that had provided cover for their midnight tribunal had exhausted itself completely, leaving behind a deceptive, brilliant stillness. In the harsh, blinding clarity of the morning, a group of men ventured out from the warmth of their hearths, walking back toward the desolate edge of the settlement. They were no longer moving with the frenzied, torch-lit energy of a righteous lynch mob. They walked with the quiet, grim practicality of men who had an unpleasant mess to clean up before the town fully awoke. The dark justice had been served in the shadows, but the physical evidence of their collective crime remained buried in the heavy drifts. They approached the barren tree, its thick, skeletal branch completely empty, the frayed end of the hemp rope dangling uselessly in the bitter wind. They looked down at the heavy, disturbed mound of snow where they had violently rolled the elderly woman hours before. They had brought shovels to quietly dispose of the body, absolutely confident that the immense weight of the ice had finished the brutal work of the noose. As the men stood over the makeshift icy grave, preparing to dig into the frost, a sudden, impossible shift occurred at their feet. It was not the winter wind disturbing the fresh, powdery surface. The dense, packed snowbank subtly, undeniably heaved. The men froze instantly in their tracks, their heavy boots planted deep in the drifts, watching in mounting horror as the hard crust of the ice cracked outward from within. A faint, ragged cloud of white vapor escaped from the freezing mound, dissolving quickly into the morning air. It was the undeniable, rhythmic cadence of human breath. Hands trembling uncontrollably, they brushed away the heavy layers of packed ice, pulling back the frozen shroud they had built with their very own hands. Beneath the frost and the dirt, Mary Webster slowly opened her eyes. Her skin was drawn and colored a terrifying, unnatural blue, and the brutal, dark purple bruising of the hemp rope was burned deep into the flesh of her neck. Yet, despite the unimaginable trauma, she was looking right back at her executioners. The frail woman they had violently dragged from her bed, hanged by the neck from a tree, and buried alive in the freezing earth, was inexplicably, miraculously alive. Modern medical understanding offers a fascinating, almost intensely ironic explanation for this bizarre historical miracle. The men of Hadley had deliberately intended for the extreme winter cold to act as a ruthless secondary executioner, making sure she could never return to curse them. Instead, those freezing temperatures likely initiated a state of profound, rapid hypothermia. As her body temperature plummeted, the immense cold drastically slowed her heart rate and severely suppressed her cellular demand for oxygen. This physiological response effectively preserved her brain and her vital organs as she lay suffocating under the heavy snow. The rope had failed to break her neck, merely strangling her into unconsciousness, and the ice had inadvertently placed her body into a protective state of suspended animation. The very elements the violent mob had weaponized to destroy her had miraculously shielded her fading life. But the terrified, pious men standing over her in the late 17th century possessed absolutely no knowledge of metabolic preservation or hypothermic survival. They did not look down and see a rare medical anomaly. They looked down and saw a woman who had simply refused to die. The psychological shift that occurred in that frozen field was absolute, permanent, and instantaneous. The mob had dragged Mary out into the darkness specifically to strip her of her terrifying power and violently eradicate her existence from their town. Now, staring down at her ragged, shallow breathing, they were completely paralyzed by a profound, suffocating terror that went far beyond anything Philip Smith had experienced. In their deeply superstitious minds, surviving a hanging was not a stroke of luck. It was the ultimate, horrifying confirmation of her dark magic. They had tried to murder a mortal widow, and they firmly believed they had just awoken an indestructible monster. The sheer horror of her survival broke the collective fever of the mob. Not a single man dared to touch her again. No one reached for the frayed rope a second time. The crowd slowly backed away in stunned silence, their wooden clubs and shovels dropping uselessly into the snow, retreating in absolute defeat from the abrasive, impoverished woman they had so desperately tried to erase. Her survival was a chilling, macabre triumph over the system that had failed her. By merely drawing a breath in the freezing morning air, Mary Webster delivered the most devastating, indestructible response to the cruelty of her neighbors. The immediate aftermath of Mary Webster's survival was not marked by apologies or a sudden return to sanity. It was defined by an absolute, paralyzed silence. The men who had dragged her from her bed did not attempt to finish the horrific job they had started. The psychological shock of seeing a dead woman open her eyes had entirely rewritten the rules of their reality. To the deeply superstitious Puritan mind, A woman who survives a proper hanging and a burial in the ice is no longer just a difficult neighbor. She is a being actively protected by forces entirely beyond human comprehension. Whether they believed she was sustained by the dark power of the devil or miraculously spared by the divine intervention of God, the undeniable result was the exact same. She was untouchable. They left her alone in the snow, terrified that if they laid even a single violent finger on her again, whatever unseen power had kept her breathing would turn its full, devastating wrath directly upon them. Mary was allowed to slowly, painfully pull herself up from the frozen earth and walk back into a town that now viewed her not just with disdain, but with absolute mortal terror. While Mary slowly recovered in her dilapidated shack, the man who had inadvertently sparked the violent frenzy was reaching his own grim conclusion. Philip Smith, the powerful deacon who had enjoyed the unwavering protection and devotion of the entire town, did not survive the week. Despite the brutal, desperate lengths his neighbors had gone to in order to break the supposed curse, his agonizing affliction only worsened. He died shortly after the failed lynching, screaming in terror, his body consumed by the mysterious illness that the 17th century physicians could never properly name. His death proved, with devastating clarity, that the violent midnight expedition had accomplished absolutely nothing. The men of Hadley had stained their hands with the darkest of sins, abandoning their humanity and their own strict laws, all to save a man who died anyway. The bitter irony of Smith's passing cemented a heavy, unspoken shame across the settlement. They had tried to execute a defenseless widow to cure an illness, and in the end, only the victim of their rage managed to survive the winter. What followed for Mary was an extraordinary second act to a life that had been violently dismissed. She did not flee the town that had tried to murder her. She stayed in Hadley, bearing the dark purple scars of the hemp rope on her neck for the rest of her days. She lived for an astonishing 11 more years, passing away peacefully from natural causes in 1696. During that decade, she essentially became a living ghost, walking the muddy streets of the settlement as a constant breathing reminder of the town's darkest night. History, with its tendency to distill complex trauma into folklore, quickly gave her a new title. She became known in the local records and whispered stories as Half-Hanged Mary. No magistrate ever charged the men who had dragged her out into the snow. No one was ever formally punished for the attempted murder. The town simply buried the event under a heavy blanket of collective silence, eager to forget what their paranoia had driven them to do. But Mary's continued, stubborn existence ensured they never truly could. There is a profound, quiet defiance in the way Mary Webster chose to live out her remaining years. She did not seek violent revenge against the men who had left her to suffocate in the ice, nor did she retreat into terrified hiding. She simply continued to exist, refusing to grant her attackers the satisfaction of her disappearance. Her calm, continued presence in the very community that had tried to destroy her stands in stark, dramatic contrast to the violent hysteria that had nearly ended her life. The people of Hadley had to wake up every single morning, attend their church services, and walk their streets, knowing that the woman they had killed was still there, watching them. They had built their entire society on the rigid belief that they possessed the absolute moral high ground, capable of distinguishing the righteous from the wicked. Yet, every time they saw the deep scars marking Mary's throat, they were forced to confront the chilling truth that the real darkness in Hadley had never come from magic. It had come directly from them. Centuries after the frost finally melted in Hadley, the story of the abrasive widow who refused to die found its way into a completely different era. The legacy of her survival did not merely fade into the obscure pages of local folklore. It was carried through generations, eventually reaching the renowned author Margaret Atwood, who is widely believed to be a direct descendant of Mary Webster. That unbreakable, defiant spirit was poured directly into the literary world. In 1995, Atwood published the poem Half-Hanged Mary, honoring the horrifying ordeal of her ancestor. But Mary's influence reached even further, serving as a profound inspiration for Atwood's towering dystopian masterpiece, The Handmaid's Tale, a novel famously dedicated to the resilient woman of Hadley. The chilling modern narrative of women stripped of their voices and pushed to the absolute margins of society was deeply rooted in the very real history of a woman who hung from a frozen branch and simply chose to open her eyes. There is a quiet, devastating truth hidden within the dark archives of 17th century colonial justice. The formidable walls of religious prejudice and the suffocating, violent panic of mob mentality were incredibly effective at silencing the vulnerable. They successfully buried countless innocent women under the heavy, inescapable weight of superstition and fear. But the rope and the winter ice ultimately failed to claim Mary. She stands as a fierce, enduring reminder that even when society builds a perfect trap, and even when a community unites entirely to impose a brutal death, there will always be those who stubbornly refuse to comply. The terrified men of Hadley desperately needed a monster to explain their own fragility, and history, often written by the powerful, was more than willing to label her a witch. But when we look back at the dark, frozen fields of Massachusetts, we do not see dark magic or a demonic curse. We see the ultimate, indestructible symbol of human survival. The bizarre miracle of Mary Webster forces us to confront the terrifying power of collective fear and the extraordinary endurance of a woman pushed past the very edge of death. If a survival story like hers stays with you, that is reason enough to keep bringing it back to the light. I would love to hear your thoughts on her incredible defiance in the comments below, and you can help uncover more of these forgotten historical cases by liking this video and subscribing to the channel.